We are starting off this episode with a little bit of Shochu history. The oldest record of Shochu comes from the 1546 essay Report on Japanese Matters by Portuguese merchant Jorge Alvarez. In his report, Alvarez wrote, people were drinking a spirit made from rice in the Yamagawa area, or today, Ibasuki City in Kagoshima Prefecture. In 1559, a carpenter in northern Kagoshima wrote the word shochu in a complaint about his employer. It read, the head priest was so cheap that he never offered us shochu. Interestingly, this is the oldest domestic written record of shochu. Cheers! Hello, ladies and gentlemen, craft spirit enthusiasts, and those interested in the intoxicating world of craft distilleries, cideries, meaderies, wineries, and the occasional foray into breweries. It's Rich Shane, and welcome to Fermented Adventure, the podcast, where we bring you the fascinating people that are making the mash, fermenting, distilling, bottling, pouring, and delivering to you some of the finest libations in the world. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. Thank you for bringing the podcast into wherever you are and whatever you're doing. We truly are grateful that you have chosen to listen and make us part of your day. It would mean the world to us if you left a 5-star review. This helps us climb in the rankings, and it makes it easier for others to find us. Don't hesitate to leave us your comments as well. If the podcast didn't meet your expectations, tell us why. We're always striving to improve. You can find us at fermentedadventure.com. We are on Instagram and Facebook as Fermented Adventure. Email us at fermentedadventure@gmail.com. All right, FA Nation, let's meet our guest. He's Christopher Pellegrini. I'm Rich Shane. This is Fermented Adventure, the podcast. Christopher, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's a distinct pleasure to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure. We met you at Bar Convent, Brooklyn, and wow, the small amount of time that we had does not go into your knowledge of shochu, Japanese culture. We've got Honkaku Spirits to talk about first. What is Honkaku Spirits?
Well, the word Honkaku actually means authentic in Japanese. So what Honkaku Spirits is an import company that brings in traditional spirits from Japan. These are spirits that are much older than Japanese whiskey. We're talking hundreds of years older, in the name of Shochu and Awamori, Awamori. Japan, Shochu's aunt, basically. It's a slightly older spirit tradition.
Here's what happens when we meet somebody like you, Christopher. It starts out with a conversation of, and you've probably had this with quite a few people, shochu. That's sake, right? Because that's all we know in the United States. Shochu is this new arrival here that has been around for such a long time. What's that experience like, bringing this new kid on the block that's not so new?
I've been doing this for a while now. So yeah, I'm going to start with a very positive. I'm going to start at the end and say it's gotten a lot better. But there were years and years of, running into the shochu versus sake question. How similar or how different are they? And then also, and you know this one, Japanese shochu versus Korean soju. And so many people think they're the same thing. They are not. And by conflating them, congratulations, you've just insulted two cultures at the same time. Nice work. But it is a very distinct type of, as you said, new in the United States, very old school in Japan, but it's really its own thing. There's nothing to compare it to. There's nothing that's quite like it. Just to answer the first question, though, sake is a brewed drink always made from rice. Brewed, just like beer and wine. Shochu is a spirit that is made from 53 approved ingredients. So it's the most diverse spirit class in the world. And it is the deepest rabbit hole you could ever encounter. I think I'll just leave it at that.
For the listener, if you're in the car, if you're running, if you're doing something when you normally listen to the Fermented Adventure podcast, Christopher is known as the Shochu Whisperer. But here's what we're going to do. I'm renaming you. I'm calling you Professor Shochu.
Okay.
Because you went from shochu to shoju. Did I get that right? The Korean version?
Oh, I went from soju, S-O-J-U, the
Soju.
Korean version, to shochu.
All right. I didn't even know there was a shoju, and you're dropping this. It's like say we are going to get such an education and such an in-depth experience. Everybody's going to be running out, and they're going to want to start filling their bar like yours to understand this experience. How did you, Professor Sochu, how did you get started with all this? What was it that tantalized you to, just get involved and get to where you are now?
I started out in craft brewing in the United States. I was home brewing. I got busted by my parents. Had an illicit home brewery in my bedroom closet. And then I took my passion for small batch craft beer to the local microbrewery, and I finagled an internship, an apprenticeship while I was still in high school. And then one fateful week, our two top brewers disappeared. One wrecked his back, and the other one, I'm not making this up, left the state to join the circus. So we had nobody in the brewery who could make beer, but 17-year-old me knew how to make beer. So I became the youngest commercial brewer in the United States. And I also became the most obsessed, annoying underage beer snob you've ever met in your life. And I developed an intense passion for small batch drinks that people will line up to fill their growlers with. And I ended up following a girl to Japan several years later, after undergrad, and after I had gone into education in the United States. And she wanted to move to Japan. And so I said, cool, let's try that for a year. 1 year became 3, 3 became 5, 5 became a mortgage. And all of a sudden I've been here for 22. I lived in Tokyo for 22 years now. And when I came here, I ran thinking I was going to be learning about sake, Japan's more internationally recognized beverage alcohol. But I ran face first into its traditional spirits, Shochu and Awamori. And I was blown away. I got here, not even knowing that Shochu existed, but I found out that Shochu outsells sake in Japan. And more recently, in 2022, there was slightly more Shochu made in Japan than tequila in Mexico. This is a huge part of the industry that's hiding in plain sight. Now, before I got to Japan, I did go by way of Korea. I lived in Korea for 2 years, where I was introduced to soju, S-O-J-U versus S-H-O-C-H-U. Now, you've all seen, everybody who's listening right now has seen those green bottles, those small green bottles of soju. That is the national drink of Korea, and it should never be confused with shochu. It's basically a vodka that's very, very heavily watered down and artificially sweetened. And it's designed to be chilled and consumed with spicy food, with company, and at pace. Shochu, on the other hand, is a slow sipper. It's higher ABV, not super high ABV. It's kind of a middling ABV. Tastes like what it's made from. Additives are never, ever, ever allowed. And it is Japan's national spirit. It's a national spirit that's consumed everywhere in Japan, but nobody outside of Japan has really heard of it yet. But it's coming. And this podcast, I think, is going to be very helpful in that respect.
Pardon the interruption. Thank you so much for listening to Fermented Adventure, the podcast. Could you do us a favor? Hit that follow button. It makes it easier for others to find us, and it helps us climb in the rankings. Take a screenshot of the podcast, post it, tag us, and let everyone know that you listen to the Fermented Adventure podcast. Now, back to our podcast. You also said something, Awamori.
That's right.
And, all right, I know a little bit about shochu, and you now have introduced me to something else, and I'm saying, all right, what is that?
Awamori is shochu's auntie. It's a slightly older distilling tradition that started in Okinawa, and where shochu can be made from 53 approved ingredients, Awamori has a much stricter sidelines and guardrails on it. It can only be made from rice. So it's a much more narrow flavor spectrum in that respect, but it's older. It's a generation older at least. And so it's taxed here in Japan as shochu, but you would never mistake an awamori that's made from rice for a rice shochu, and a common style of shochu. They don't taste anything alike.
What was your first shochu experience? What led you on this path to where you're saying, I'm going to spend the next 22 years immersing myself in the culture and just falling in love with this spirit?
When I first got here, both my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and I were poor. And she worked evenings at a dry cleaner so that we could to help pay the rent. And I used to go towards the train station every night. It was a really kind of treacherous walk home because there were no sidewalks on the side of that street, and it was dark. So I just didn't want her to get hit. So I would walk her home after work. And I soon discovered there was a little izakaya right not too far from where she worked. So if she was taking a while to get out of the dry cleaner, I would just go and have a glass of sake. And they had a pretty modest selection, but the bottles were changing. And so I went in there and I thought, hey, this is a good place to learn. One day when it was raining, I remember the owner was bored because there were no other customers. And he decided to push my first shochu in front of me. Now, if you had told me at that time, you'd be like, would you like some shochu? I would have heard soju. And I had just lived in Korea for 2 years. I knew all about soju and I was not interested in having any more of it. So I would have said, no, thank you. But he pushed a drink in front of me. He said, try it. And I tried it. And it's like, that's not sake. That's a spirit. He's like, yeah. What do you think? Not bad. It's pretty interesting. Made from a grain, right? He's like, yes, barley. So then he turned around. He dropped another cup in front of me. Sweet potato. I smelled it. I was like, whoa, I think you made a mistake. There's no way those two things are the same because they really, really present like the fermentation. Whatever the fermentation smelled like, that's what the drink's going to smell like. And so he was like, no, they're the same. I was like, all right, took a sip. Oh, wow, so different. Then came a buckwheat or a soba shochu. There was I think a kokuto sugar shochu, and finally a rice shochu, all clear as water, all different as can be. And I was immediately just, my mind was in the process of just exploding at this point. Like, where do they make this stuff? He's down south in Kyushu. And within a couple of weeks, I was on a plane and I was going down all the time. And that's where the rabbit hole started for me. This spirit very quickly to me became, in my head, it was the craft beer of the spirits world. It was so diverse in its attack, its flavor profile, its aroma, its weight. And I just needed to know more. And this was in 2003. There's no Wikipedia article about this. I don't even know if Wikipedia was born yet, but I was in deep smit. And that became what is now my life's calling.
You're on a mission. You're taking your passion and expanding it and exposing people like me and Dawn to this wonderful world that you have such like feelings for. I mean, it's a passion. And
it is.
When did it become a business though? Like, what was the switch? Like, I got to go see it. I mean, yeah, if you're into baseball, you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, you go to a lot of different venues, you collect memorabilia. You're on a plane to start visiting these shochu distilleries and immersing yourself. When did this like say, I need to like just be the Pied Piper of shochu?
Well, it ended up, it was a bumpy start because I didn't speak any Japanese at the time. The first thing I learned to say in Japanese was thank you. And then the second thing I learned how to say was no foam on my beer, please. And that's about as far as as hard as I worked, because I only planned to be in Japan for a year at that point. That was our plan was a year, then head back and do something else. We know that we're still here to this day, 22 years later. But at first it was bumpy because they wouldn't let me into the distilleries. I would just sort of knock on the door and they're like, hi, or I'm just this bright-eyed kid and was saying, can I see how you make it? And they're like, no, go away, and slam the door in my face. And that happened for a while, but I'm gregarious. I don't care. I'm staying overnight in this small mountain town. I'm going to a pub or a izakaya. I'm going to meet the locals and have a great time. And I'm going to come back. And so I kept going back, and it was long weekends and just keep going back. And eventually somebody said, hey, there's an American kid. He's harmless. He just wants to see how shochu is made. And eventually somebody on a slow day let me in. And that was the beginning of just this, just the floodgates open. And I got so passionate about learning. It was so different from making beer. The sacrification, it's on a nerd level, just so different. And I got even more passionate about it. I started to spend a lot more time down south, and I started to make friends. And I started to study the language because I was so fascinated by this aspect of Japanese culture, quite frankly. And eventually, over a period of years, they would say, "Hey, we're short staffed. Can you come and stir pots for a couple of days when you're not doing your main job?" And I would say yes and go down there, and I would eat with the family and make these connections. And then I fell in love with these families who weren't making more shochu than they could sell locally, but these families had this shochu business for sometimes more than 100 years. And then I started to feel like, well, I want them to hand it down to the next generation. We need to get this message out. We got to tell more people. So then I started to proselytize up in Tokyo, because I figured, hey, there's tons of non-Japanese living up there. I'll just set up events, get shochu makers up, awamori makers up. We'll do tastings and fun parties and things. And so I started to do that. But a funny thing happened. And this really forced my Japanese studies to really go into sixth gear. Most of the guests at my parties and my events were Japanese folks, because they wanted to hear about this traditional spirit from a different perspective. So I'm like, well, I'm not hitting the audience that I was trying to hit. I should write a book. So I wrote a book. I wrote it, published in 2014, the Shochu Handbook. Then I got knighted by the Japanese government as an ambassador for these traditional spirits. So I spent a lot of time traveling around the world, and it just kind of snowballed and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And now I'm on the business side of things as well. And it's my favorite thing ever.
You have a moment to go back in time and talk to, let's say, 16-year-old Christopher before he finds his way into the brewery. What do you tell him about what to expect when he gets to where you are now?
I would have given him the advice that, number one, listen more than you speak. Always. I talk a lot. I'm talking all the time right now, but I am actually quite pensive under normal circumstances. And I'm often one of the last people to speak during meetings. Another thing is study languages, which I ended up doing all the time. And then also study computers, which I wish I had done more of, because so much of my time is spent, most people's time is spent, looking at this screen and manipulating things using code and designing and those sorts of things. And I would have said, listen, it's going to be a crazy, crazy ride from here on out, but just roll with the punches. You're going to get some bad bounces, but you're also going to get some good bounces if you just trust your instincts and go with it. So I think my 16-year-old self would hear what I'm saying and be like, yo, whatever. There's no way I'm ending up in Japan for half of my life. But hey, hopefully it worked out. So maybe in some corner of that kid's brain, there was an openness to it.
You publish the Shochu Handbook. You become knighted, and you're an ambassador. Is there a ceremony that goes along with being knighted? Do you bend down on one knee and is it what happens?
No, they just sprinkle Shochu in your face. No, it's there was a ceremony. It was down in Okinawa, and I got sort of christened as this ambassador for these spirits at the same time that the government knighted a karate ambassador as well. So our ceremony was together. There were tons of people there that I didn't know, and I didn't actually know there was going to be a ceremony. They're like, we're giving you this title. I was like, okay, great. What do you need me to do? And they're like, you have to travel around the world. I was like, oh, okay, that sounds good. But there was a ceremony that I wasn't prepared for, and they wanted me to speak at the ceremony too. I was like, great.
Speak to the evolution of how your passion now has become a business of these spirits, these people you meet along the way, and the explosion of what we can expect from shochu and people consuming it now more readily.
It was before the pandemic that I was starting to get a little bit frustrated with the rate of uptake internationally of these amazing stories about Shochu, Awamori, the people, the process, the place. And so I decided to get even more skin in the game. And I co-invested in an export outfit here in Japan, in Fukuoka down south. And then during the pandemic, March 6th, 2020, amazing timing, I threw in the towel on my tenured position as a writing instructor at a local university it's a massive university in downtown Tokyo, and co-founded Honkaku Spirits in New York to get the other side of the international trade equation set in motion. And so that has become just a crazy education for myself in terms of trying to co-manage two different teams in two different businesses in two different time zones with two very different philosophies for how teams work together and how to accomplish their goals. And it's been just a very humbling, very educational experience. But I spent about 6 months of my life in Japan, both working with suppliers and brand development and, of course, the necessary logistics of export. And then another 6 months of my life in the United States, traveling around the country, usually living out of 2 suitcases and educating everybody and anybody, everyone from the bar staff, the bar manager, the servers in restaurants and bars, to our distribution partners, to folks on the floor at liquor stores, to bartenders and doing workshops for bartenders to get these drinks into cocktails. And that's where America is going to, and the rest of the world, quite frankly, is going to experience these drinks really first in any concerted manner, is on cocktail menus, most likely. The bartender, as we both know, is a bit of a gatekeeper for better or worse. And once they get excited about something, they really do kind of dig in. And once they have enough information to be confident to transmit those stories to other people, they become amazing evangelists for things that they fall in love with. So I think that's where it's going to hit next. And I spend tons of time in bars, for better or worse. I drink way too many sugary cocktails as I try to learn about these things and try to have conversations with folks who can probably move the needle a little bit. But we're 4 years in, a little over 4 years in, and I'm learning every single day of my life.
All right, we have these 6 expressions here, and I'm going to say it, and then you can correct me on my pronunciation. I'm going to say Mogai Hoka.
Mugi Hoka.
I think Mugi Hoka. All right.
Yep.
I think I'm going to name my firstborn that just because I love the sound. It sounds like Doogie Howser to me, and I don't know why.
Nice. I like that. Maybe we just call it Doogie from now on.
Mogai Hoka.
Mugi
Hoka is
there you go.
Our first one. And, you make a great point when you talk about these spirits, because they're all crystal clear except for one. Talk about, all right, we have this roasted barley shochu. So talk about this one first. But you said they're all different.
They're all wickedly different.
Yeah.
So Mugi Hoka is kind of industry standard ABV. This is 25% ABV, 50 proof. And it's an example of a roasted barley shochu. Now, barley is the second most popular by sales volume shochu sold in Japan. And it's over 40% of domestic sales. There's a lot of barley shochu consumed in this country. Now, this one is roasted barley. So we like to refer to it as French breakfast, because on the nose, you're going to get some of that toasted baguette, the cacao, a lot of espresso, quite honestly. But it's just barley and barley only. There are no additives, again, as I said. And so this is a nice and warm and full, toasty spirit. But at 25% is not going to knock your face off. It will not surprise you to hear that it ends up in espresso martinis all across the United States. And it's a very good lower ABV, very low calorie option for that type of vehicle.
I don't know how we connected on that, but when I started nosing this, I thought to myself, breakfast. And I literally said to myself, I don't know why my brain, the first thing it said was breakfast. But to your point, you get those coffee notes, you get those cacao notes, the barley, you can actually, it's like those sugar, like barley. I feel like it's like a breakfast treat or something. It's such a sweet nose and such a sweet palate, but it has there's a thinness to it, but there's a viscosity of flavor. Is the best way I can. I've never thought of that, but there's so many flavors hitting you in so many different directions from this.
It's probably our most popular at this point shochu in the portfolio, and it's because of all of that depth and toast to it. It's also about to go into a Negroni of all things at the lobby bar in the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan. It's a Jose Andres property actually, and they're gonna use it as a modifier in a Negroni, and it's so good. It gives this nice toast and really warm edge to a Negroni that is hard to achieve elsewise.
You spoke about the fact that the bartender is going to be the gatekeeper. They're going to be the ones that are going to be to that customer. I sit down at the lobby bar and I'm looking at the menu and what is shochu, or what is this, or what is this cocktail? I know in Negroni, why are you using this? Shochu itself, people may think of it as just this spirit that you add an ice cube to or a little bit of soda to.
That's right.
But you made a point to say we can make this as, we can add as a modifier, something when you think of Negroni, that absinthe, right? The variety of ways that we're going to be able to use this, I really think is going to be also dictated to all these different flavor profiles. It's not just going to say, I'm going to make an old fashioned and I'm going to make this old fashioned because I have all these different shochus to choose from.
Yeah.
And as a base or as a modifier for a cocktail, there's so much color that you can add to that painting.
That's right. And I think that there's already a number of shochu-centric cocktail competitions going on that attract increasing attention from bartenders across the United States. It certainly helps that the winner tends to get a free trip to Japan. But there is a lot of energy kind of swirling around all of this whole new, it's like the flavor spectrum has a whole new neighborhood that has been unlocked in these drinks. And it's a very, very savory, really diverse palette that we're just getting to know outside of Japan. And, Mugi Hoka is a nice introduction to that. If we move on to the next one, you're going to just be like, huh? This is a shochu too, huh? And that's what happened to me. I thought the guy was pulling my leg, that all of these things were the same type of spirit. But this is...
I want to say it, and then you can correct me.
Okay,
I'm going to say Shigemasu.
Yes, you got it. Bingo.
Oh.
And this is our newest product, actually. It just landed. So you're one of the first people in the United States to try it, actually. And this is a sake lees shochu. So this is a shochu made from the leftover rice solids of a very high quality sake fermentation.
This is so wonderfully fruity and plum-like, I'm going to say, but is it lychee? There's a nose to that. And this is where we get into the umami that shochu is known for, or should be more known for, is that umami component. It's where you stop and say, I have no idea what that is, but it's so pleasing to the mouth and the nose.
Yeah.
What is this?
Well, this is essentially, it's the most geographically disparate style of shochu made in Japan. It typically is made by sake breweries. And what they do is they know that there's still alcohol present in the sake lees after they press the sake and collect whatever drips out. You filter it, and that's your sake. And they want to use those rice solids. So one thing you can do is you can restart the fermentation, distill that, and remove all of the alcohol. And then you can reuse the solids in whatever way you want. Many times it's for cosmetics. They sometimes use these rice lees for the sake lees for confection, like sweet treats and that sort of thing. But you also have a spirit now that smells very much like a sake. What you're getting on the nose is those tropical notes that is typical of a daiginjo sake. And I'm talking green apple and melon and bubblegum and cotton candy. And you said lychee and a bunch of star fruit and mango. And there's all sorts of, and sometimes even a little bit of like a black licorice anise type of note. Sometimes, depending on how warm the glass is, you'll get a little bit more of a dairy note to it. But it's a really interesting, slightly higher ABV, 30.5% ABV that is doesn't have the residual sugars of a sake. It's a very dry drink, but it does have a lot of fruitiness. You're absolutely right.
The way you took us on that tour, to the left, you're going to see like a dairy note. And to the right, you're going to see star anise and tropical and liquor. It all came through as you pointed that out. And I'm thinking about the fact that other than needing to speak Japanese, some of these experiences that you shared when you did these tastings and just the way you have taken this desire to share this with the world and be so knowledgeable. I'm kind of like I love nosing this and then sipping this and nosing it and sipping it and getting a better understanding of what this is and why this is.
Yeah.
I'm still like you go back and you're going back to 2003, 2004, launching a business in 2020. And I would say you just did BarCon in Brooklyn. How many people still, as they were in the industry, came past you and said, what is this? What are you pouring? And they don't even know about this.
They don't. You're right. It is still very early days. We're in chapter 1. We're on floor 1. We're just getting started, but it is better than it used to be. I mean, I did Bar Combat in Brooklyn before the pandemic. And while that was an improvement, it was still, most people, you say the word shochu, they hear soju and they're just like, no, I don't need that. But what's great about now, quite honestly, is like, especially with bartenders have heard of shochu now. They know that it's special. They know that they need to understand it. And I saw you at first up on the second floor at the Awamori corner, Awamori Alley up there, where a bunch of the makers from Okinawa were set up. And bartenders were coming up there. And I would ask, hey, have you ever heard of spirits from Japan like shochu? And they're like, yeah, I've heard of shochu, but what I really want to try is Awamori. And that was next level. I was like, oh, wow, we've really turned a corner here. There's a little bit more knowledge out there, but people are very much in the discovery phase. So it's a lot of fun. And the spirit that you're still nosing right now, I think they're really going to enjoy that one.
This is, you can go out and here, I would say, I want to try, let's say, a cocktail with rye, and I want to try a cocktail with bourbon, and we'll go to a gin cocktail, and we'll go to all these different experiences of a cocktail, or I want to pour something neat. And literally, I think it'd be exciting just to go to a bar, let's say in Japan, and have all like the bottles that you have behind you. What did you say? It's the largest shochu bar in West.
This is
Tokyo?
Definitely the best shochu. My office is the best shochu bar west of downtown.
Yeah, and you're just like, oh wait, grabbing a bottle. Here, try this. Here, try this.
Yeah.
But you're not getting like, all right, so you could do a bourbon. And all right, I can say maybe that's more corn forward, or maybe that's more spicy and rye, and maybe that's sweet, and maybe this. Sure. Here's a shochu, and this is what you're going to get. This, and this is another one, and then this is another one.
Yeah,
I can literally, this flight we're experiencing together is like, well, that's a different one, and that's a different one, and I go back to that conversation you had when you went and you were waiting for your girlfriend at the time to be done work, and here, try this, and your mind is blown.
Yeah, man,
that's what you get to recreate
rocked.
all the time, Christopher. You get to have that experience with somebody else, except you're the bartender.
I know,
and I'm the one waiting for somebody to get done their job.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun to bring people on this voyage of discovery. It really is a true pleasure.
Shiran T. Chu.
Shiran Tichu. Yes, it's a green tea shochu. Beautiful label. And this is a trip. It's an absolute trip. It's a sweet potato shochu fermentation that has just a ton of fresh green tea leaves added to the fermentation. So it's almost like you would hop a beer, kind of, because obviously tea leaves don't have any fermentable sugars in them, but they have a lot of flavor and aroma. So what you're getting on the nose is this beautiful kind of old school, earthy, funky, spicy sweet potato nose that has a kind of a mild green tea to it, kind of a green tea crust. And on the palate, the green tea is going to come out more. And that astringency from the green tea plays very well with the sweet potatoes. And as they say, you know, what grows together goes together. And this is very much a case in point.
I drink green tea all the time. And I also do matcha. And what hits me are the earthy components that I really look forward to and really want. I don't know, you know, even the ABV, it's a nice brightness to it that I think exposes the components of the tea. And I wouldn't know. And the next one we're going to try is a sweet potato shochu.
That's right. Yep.
But for where I am at, can you actually sit down now blindfolded and say, that's a sweet potato, that's a barley, can you nose or taste the difference of the grain component or the fermented component in it?
Certainly. I mean, that you have to be able to in order to get your shochu sam certification in Japan. So,
all right, now I know why they call you the shochu whisperer.
Yeah. So, and these are so wickedly different, as I said before. You could, after just sipping them once or nosing them once, we could do a blind tasting with you, switch them all around, and you would get it right 10 times out of 10.
I'm curious. We utilize here the Glencairn, and selfish plug, our Glencairns are brought to you by Scott Wishart of Scott's Mini Woodshop, and Charmaine helped with the design. I keep leaving Charmaine out. We're drinking out of a Glencairn. I mean, what glass would you use, or what would you be drinking out if I was doing neat pours that I wanted to have that experience and understand what shochu was in Japan, or what should we be using here?
I think Glencairns are great. I anything with a little bit of a tulip to it to help and hold in the aroma, because it's not very high ABV, and you want to make sure that those esters stick around for a little while longer. And so I like the Glencairn quite a lot.
You took me on a little tour of some things behind you on the bar, and you showed me a warming kettle.
Yeah.
And my first introduction to sake was like a lot of people. It's in that little carafe.
Yeah,
they
basically.
give you the ceramic glass. You get it heated. And then I meet John Gontner, who introduces me to this wonderful world of sake. We were at Brooklyn Cora, and I almost, again, these are my first experiences with like really well-brewed craft sake. And I was feeling like, hey, kid, you've been doing it wrong all this time. If it's bad or it's not quality sake, that's why they're reheating it. That's why you're getting it hot.
They're hiding it. Yep.
So why talk about this? Is it a ceremony, or why am I warming shochu?
So the shochu, one of the traditional ways to enjoy shochu is to cut it 50-50 with hot water and then drink it with dinner. That's going to knock the ABV down into kind of low wine territory, actually kind of a little bit below the ABV of a sake. And the heat does a really good job of uncovering any sweet notes that are hiding in there. So I know sweet potato shochu has the word sweet, right? Or sweet potato, sweet in the ingredient name. But a lot of the old school sweet potatoes and there are 6 varietals of sweet potato used to make shochu in Japan. It's like the rainbow. There's a lot of old school sweet potatoes that are earthier and funkier than they are sweet. So if you have one of those old school sweet potato shochu and you heat it up, it actually kind of unlocks some of those sweet notes, and it becomes even more aromatic. You're not hiding anything per se. What you're doing is you're unleashing it. So it's a very different animal when heat is applied. And it's a pretty common old school way to do it. Now, these days, the new school serves are much more common. Highballs, rocks are very, very common. But my way to drink it is the traditional way, oyuwari, which is cut usually 50-50 with hot water. So no, it's not a way to hide anything untoward. And yes, I won't drink heated sake unless the venue in question has you have to look for the hot water bath on the counter with little aluminum cups hanging over the side. And if they have one of those, they probably know what they're doing. And I'll drink their heated sake at that place. But otherwise, if it's just like a typical izakaya and they're doing heated sake, I'm going to say no, thank you.
You were speaking about the sweet potato shochu. This colorful, that's the easiest one to pronounce for me. That's good.
I'm glad you got that one right.
But then you got me thinking about so many varieties of sweet potato. And here's where I'm going to. Again, this is more of an exposure to Japanese food, Japanese culture, to say, I don't know, I thought maybe there was just the orange sweet potato that we know, but you're telling me it's not just I'm going to make a sweet potato shochu. I'm going to find, let's say, a different sweet potato. How many varieties of sweet potato? Then you start to say, all right, I'll ferment this one, and then I'll ferment this one, and I'll blend them, or I'll start bringing in them. There's a whole world of just sweet potato shochu.
It's the biggest and most popular subcategory of the industry by sales even. There are thousands of sweet potato shochu brands released every year in Japan. And it's just, like you said, it's an unending, just every day a new shochu is possible. Now, what you have in your hand, colorful, is what I call new school sweet potato shochu. And these are brighter sweet potatoes. It would include orange. It would include red and purple and everything in between. And they tend to be brighter and fruitier than the old school sweet potatoes, which are usually white fleshed. And so this is a very popular brand in Japan. It's kind of a flex for us. We shouldn't have it. I can't even hardly get it in Tokyo where I live because the gentleman who makes it, Mr. Yano, doesn't need the metro market. He can sell it all down south. But fortunately, he's a drinking buddy of mine. And I was able to beg him enough times to sell us an allocation. And now you can get it across the United States, which is kind of a coup for us. And it is certainly a flex for us to be able to let people enjoy this. Now, this one is very bright and very fruity. And one of my favorite notes on this is, do you remember those hard strawberry candies that your grandmother always had a bowl of in like the strawberry wrapper? Smell it again. It's a strawberry bonbon.
You know what? And this is the wonderful thing. I'm not getting the strawberry.
No, you're not? Okay.
I am not. And that doesn't it's always like I can come up with some sort of thing out of left field. Or maybe it's one of those things I get that nobody gets or we all get, which is the wonderful thing. I think, maybe is it oxygenates or, allows,
it's a vintage. So for instance, in front of me, I have the 2022 vintage, and this one definitely has the strawberry bonbon, but the 2023 vintage has more of a bergamot or like an Earl Grey tea thing going on with it. And at the expense of the strawberry hard candy that tends to be on the 2022. So it does depend on the vintage because the blend is slightly different every year and the sweet potatoes are different every time too. So it's, it's a very seasonally affected, much like my allergies type of spirit, especially at the smaller end of the scale.
There's a point again where the nose and the flavor, there's like this shelf in my nose. There's like a shelf in the back of my mouth that there's a flavor that hits there and it just sits there and lingers.
Mm.
It's just a pleasurable experience. And you talked about vintages. Mm-hmm. Are there better seasons for sweet potatoes? Are there, times where somebody might say, this needs more red, this needs more orange, this needs more. Is that how it comes together?
Well, the sweet potato harvesting season starts in August in Japan, and they'll generally have high enough quality sweet potatoes that they're still pulling out of the ground, sometimes into December. But the sweet potato shochu season, I think we can safely say, is basically August to January down south. And yeah, every year's a little different. Now, if you have a brand that every year uses the same sweet potatoes and there's some problem with that species of sweet potato or that varietal, then you might not be able to make any of that brand in a given season. Now, larger distilleries can circumvent this by using frozen sweet potatoes, but sweet potatoes, at least the ones that are harvested down south in Japan, are very susceptible to injury, and they have to be used incredibly fresh. So that's why sweet potato shochu is really only made in the late summer and fall and early winter, because those sweet potatoes are pulled out of the ground. They leave the earth caked on them so that they think that they're still in the ground, because as soon as they realize that they're not anymore, they start to degrade, they start to decompose. So you rush them to the distillery. First thing in the morning, you got a team of folks sitting out on overturned milk crates, essentially, inspecting them, cleaning them off, cutting them open and inspecting everyone by hand. It's all done by hand, every single sweet potato. We're talking tons of sweet potatoes arriving fresh from the fields. And then they go into the second stage of the fermentation when you make a sweet potato shochu. And so, yes, there is a little bit of like what's available there, but there's also more of just like how much of this particular varietal can we get our hands on this calendar year? And then that's about how much they can hope to produce and sell. So the small guys have it a little rougher because they're dealing only with fresh spuds. The big guys can do frozen.
The way that you characterize that, I'm picturing these people sitting around just looking at sweet potatoes and inspecting them. But what hits me is the significance of the terroir, that provenance, that you're going to get such a unique, this is how the gentleman that you mentioned that does the colorful, that's the character of his shochu.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe another town over, there's somebody else with a different character.
110%.
Here you just stop and think, I just thought shochu was shochu. And now I'm getting like, it's not. And what I think the number was 52, right?
53 approved ingredients.
53 yep. approved ingredients.
Yep. And Southern Kyushu is one of the most volcanic places on earth. And so it's sweet potato. I mean, it's just like in the Andes, sweet potatoes love ashy soil, but the prevailing winds tend to blow the ash into specific valleys and areas where they're growing the sweet potatoes. Talk about terroir. Sweet potatoes spend every moment of their life up until about 6 hours before they go into the fermentation underground. That's a terroir story if I've ever heard one. And sometimes, depending on which part of Japan the spuds are harvested in, you can taste the ashiness. You're like, oh, this is downwind from that angry mountain over there, isn't it? Right? These sweet potatoes are clearly from over there because you can taste it. There's a minerality in those sweet potatoes that is not present in sweet potatoes that are upwind from a major volcano. So it's a fascinating undiscovered aspect of Japanese spirits. The fact that you can sort of use the word terroir, especially when you go to these distilleries and you see a lot of these fermentations are open. They're uncovered. The windows are open. The doors are open. It's a microclimate in there that affects the fermentation. It's unbelievable. And you'll understand as soon as you set foot in one of these places why I fell so head over heels for them right from the off.
I can understand why you were knighted, why you're an ambassador. I'm about ready to tell Dawn we're getting on a plane. We're setting up shop somewhere. And I want to immerse myself in the education and understanding of all that, because as you describe it, it's actually it's like a romance novel in a way. Yeah. And when you had that, you're knocking on everybody's door, go away, kid. And then you kind of circumvented that by talking to the receptionist outside,
befriending the locals, basically. Yeah.
You got the big door opened. You got in the house to see how it's made. And then every time you meet somebody new, it's like, wait a second, they did this. Now you're doing this. And look at how you're doing that. And then, oh, wait, you have to meet so-and-so. And I feel like that's what's happening here, Christopher. You're like, wait till you try this one and learn about how this is. I mean, we have 6. I can only imagine with all the bottles behind you, every single one of these shochu distilleries is unique and has its own story.
It's amazing.
It's crazy. It's crazy. So, I mean, you basically, you're in it for the long haul. You got so much runway to go and so much exposure to give people to shochu. This is your life's calling. I love it.
I'm very, very lucky. I'm so lucky that something that I felt so passionate about could become a vocation. And I know it's the goal for a lot of folks, but if you can, I do honestly get done with very stressful days, and still I'm very grateful for the fact that I get to do this. I get to still be the Pied Piper of shochu.
You set the table. Awamori. I'm 5 in. I'm on my 6th. So you can be my crunch on pronunciation. Yoka. I'm going to say Yoka Koji.
Yes, that's perfect. You got it. Yoka Koji. Yep.
Awamori. And so you set the table on this whole different genre, the auntie of shochu.
That's right. And
how is this like? How is it, this one here? Talk about the story here in the distillery.
So this is a pretty remarkable one. And I often start by telling people, listen, don't use this particular spirit to judge or be the yardstick for Awamori, because it's not standard at all. A standard Awamori is usually bottled at 30% ABV. It's going to have a light mushroom, pretty pronounced minerality and funk to it. And usually in Okinawa, where it's produced, they're going to cut it 50-50 with mineral water, pour it over ice, and drink it with dinner. And so that means it's about a 15% ABV drink when it hits the table. And they drink it with food, and they drink a lot of it. Now, this is not that. This is a 43% ABV flavor bomb that is called Yoka Koji. And in Japanese, Yoka means 4 days. And the word Koji is, and I know folks have probably heard this word by now, it's on a lot of food menus, and it's used to make, it's a fungus, it's a mold. This is really sexy. It's Japan's national mold that is used to make everything delicious that's fermented in Japan, like miso and sake and soy sauce and mirin. And of course, all shochu, all awamori, and some other spirits are made with this mold. And usually when you use the mold, it takes the mold propagation process, which basically takes the place of malting. There's no malted grains in any of these drinks today. It's all kojified, K-O-J-I, kojified grains and spuds and other ingredients sometimes. And it takes the place of malting in that the molds will saccharify, meaning they convert starches into simple soluble sugars, namely glucose. Sugar can be fermented, starches cannot. And so you have this very flavorful koji component that imparts umami. And that koji process usually takes 2 days. Now, before I said yoka actually means 4 days. So these maniacs doubled the length of this unforgiving process, and they teased out all this extra flavor and aroma. Now, I love yoka koji because it kind of is like a child. It's like a 9-year-old. It doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up, so it tries to be everything. And at first blush, it's kind of like an unoaked whiskey on the palate. And then in the middle, it zigs on you, and you've got, wait a second, where'd that green apple note come from? That's weird. Green, like those fat green pears from Japan, something like that. And then it zags. And at the end, it's like a smoky, like almost a sesame note at the back. And it is kind of taking the cocktail scene by storm, but a little bit more divey than that. Dive bar-esque is it's gone into a lot of Okinawan Boilermakers across the country. You get a Japanese lager in a can and a frozen shot of yoka koji, and that'll set you on the right path. The Okinawan Boilermaker.
You characterize this as it doesn't know what it wants to be. And again, that experience that you have to take me through this, to your point, it's, wait, whiskey, tequila, where's this going? And then you understand what the koji and the flavor profile, what is, and in my head, I'm thinking, because as we think about American spirits or whiskeys or things of that nature, what's the mash bill? What is, besides the koji, what are they fermenting in this?
So it's all awamori is 100% kojified rice. I mean, that's it.
So it's just rice and koji.
It's rice with this koji mold on it that has converted the rice into something that resembles a grape, essentially. It turned a starchy grain into a little sugar packet, essentially. And the mold itself, which goes into the fermentation as well, imparts tons of umami into the drink. That's where umami comes from. The glutamates are from the kojification process. That's, if that can be a word. And it is something that is not present yet in most Western cultures, but it is or something similar is present all across Asia. This aspect of koji fermentation and how everything is so rich and so deep over in this part of the world with their flavor profiles. A lot of that is due to koji. And so it's just kojified rice, yeast, and water. That's it.
A question just popped into my head. In the United States, we've had cultures come and settle here.
Right.
And they bring their traditions, they bring their beverages, they bring things from home. And one of them, if you're coming from Japan, nobody is opening up a shochu distillery. People are not, again, we've had so many years of Japanese culture here in the United States, but nobody stopped, like, the Germans opened breweries.
Sure.
And they opened distilleries, and the Irish did that. And, you have that experience of that history of cultures coming here and bringing what they know from home.
Sure.
Nobody opened up. I can't say nobody, but
until recently.
Sure you're talking recently, but we're also talking about a spirit that outsells tequila. Yeah,
that's right.
Why are there no shochu, or why are there very few, or why haven't there been shochu distilleries?
And why isn't there koji in our food, really, until very recently? And there were attempts. We know that there were attempts. And in fact, our last drink, the whiskey, I think that was a great segue to this last drink, takamine. Sorry, I said it before you had a chance.
That's all right.
Give it a shot.
It was bound to happen eventually.
Takamine. Right,
so I'm grateful that you kept this for last, because again, my mindset thinks Japanese whiskey, and you could have gone to Japan and you could have been enamored with Japanese whiskey, which is a whole world into itself.
Of course. Yeah. No lies
now
detected
you're bringing me this takamine, this 8-year-old koji whiskey. So if I understand from your education you just gave me, there's rice, there's koji, and now I'm sticking it in a barrel for 8 years.
You're close. There's no rice in this case. This is 100% barley.
Okay.
But none of that barley has been malted. It's been kojified. So there are no malted grains harmed in the production of this spirit. It's only kojified barley. And then also some unkojified barley as well as added to the second stage of fermentation. But this is probably the best story or second best story in spirits. The Uncle Nearest story is pretty phenomenal. This is maybe number 2 in the world of spirits, as far as I know. And this is a story of how koji almost entered U.S. gustatory culture back in the 1800s. So long story short, a Japanese genius by the name of Dr. Jokichi Takamine ended up in New Orleans as part of a delegation to the World's Fair, which was textile heavy at that time. And it was in New Orleans, and he fell in love with a young woman named Caroline Hitch, who's from New Orleans. And they eventually they end up getting married. And this is remarkable. This is in the 1880s or late 1870s. And Dr. Takamine convinces this rich family to let one of their daughters marry him. They start a family, and he wasn't the most romantic of newlywed husbands, but allegedly on his honeymoon, they were visiting fertilizer factories, and he was a patent maven. He had run the patent office in Japan when it was first established after the Meiji Restoration, very young age. He's a genius, and so he's drafting patents on the honeymoon. And I'm sure Caroline was intensely annoyed with him, but one of those patents, believe it or not, ended up being awarded the first ever biologic patent in US history. And it wasn't for anything medical, even though he was a doctor. He patented the process of making a maltless whiskey, a koji whiskey, in the 1880s. He had the patent. And he farmed that patent out to the Illinois Whiskey Trust. And the Illinois Whiskey Trust at the end of the 1800s was making 80% of spirits in America from their 65 distilleries across the country. It was the biggest monopoly to ever have monopoly in the history of monopolization. They had their fingers in every pie. And they wanted this patent because they ran the numbers. And they figured out if they could take malted grains out of whiskey production and insert this weird, it was patented as the Takamine process. If they could use this magical Takamine method from Japan, they were going to save about 20% on their production costs. So they licensed the patent from him. He moved his family to Peoria, Illinois. And the Manhattan Distillery lived there. It was the biggest distillery in America at the time. And they gave him a laboratory. And he set about trying to crack the code. How do we make a maltless whiskey? And he figured it out. Now, just before, as they were converting this part of this massive distillery over towards koji fermentation rather than malted, they don't need a malt ingress area. They don't need a lauter tun, no mash tun, no hot side really. They just need steam to steam the grains and then use the koji. The one of the major newspapers in Chicago found out about this, and they wrote Takamine's name for the one and only time. They said whiskey to become cheaper. Now, for the layperson, that's great news. But for the folks who made malt, this was the worst thing ever because a foreign guy was about to put them out of the whiskey industry. So 2 weeks after that article ran, they broke into the distillery at night and they tried to kill him. Now, they missed, fortunately. He escaped into the bowels of the basement of the distillery, but they found his lab, which they incinerated. Anyways, takes him a while, but in December of 1894, Dr. Takamine becomes the first Japanese person ever to make a whiskey in the history of Japan, but he was doing it in Peoria. And they were quietly barreling what was going to be known as bonsai whiskey. And they were stacking it up. But then, February 1895, the Sherman Antitrust Act under Teddy Roosevelt was used for the one and only time in the 19th century to bust a trust. And of course, it was used against the one with a Japanese guy at the front of it. And that was it. Everything sold off. His patent was sold off to the highest bidder illegally because it was licensed to the trust, but they just sold it. And America was weeks from koji whiskey being as American as bourbon is today. That would have been our style. But if it hadn't been for violent competition coming from the malt makers and then government intervention, we would be a koji whiskey society today because they had 65 distilleries and they were in the business of making mad amounts of money. And they would have just converted all the distilleries to koji whiskey making. But he gets chased out of town and the story gets better from here. He goes from the Manhattan Distillery to Manhattan, New York. And this is why this story should be a Hollywood film, I swear. He can't make whiskey anymore because he doesn't have the patent. Somebody else has the patent. And he can't make a koji whiskey ever again. So he falls back on his pharmaceutical roots and he moves his family to the Upper West Side, I believe is where it was. He had a 5-floor walk-up. And he had a home laboratory because apparently that was legal. In his home lab, and this is why he's famous to this day, after even 100 years after his death. In his home laboratory, he isolated for the first time in human history a human hormone. He isolated epinephrine, which is medical adrenaline, which became the EpiPen. So Takamine almost changed whiskey, but he failed at that, but he saved millions of lives with the EpiPen. So, now he licenses that to Park Davis. He's phenomenally wealthy. I think from that license, he made $30 million by 1906 in US dollars, 1906 US dollars. That's $1 billion today. He was a Japanese Rockefeller walking around Manhattan, essentially, but he was Japanese, so he couldn't join the Gentleman's Club. So he said, whatever, I'll make my own. So he established the Nippon Club, which exists to this day. All the foreign dignitaries wanted to hang out there because it was the nicest, the biggest, most opulent club. And he became this really gentle, unassuming guy, just became this informal ambassador for Japan before the World War. And because he really wanted America and Japan to get along, he privately, anonymously financed and facilitated the donation of the cherry trees to Washington, D.C. That's all his money. And he didn't want credit for it. So we didn't find out until later that it was him. But he's just this epic human being that nobody's ever heard of. I mean, nobody in America, you say Takamine, everybody thinks you're talking about a guitar. And in Japan, people have heard of the cherry trees, but they don't really pay him any respect because he did all his best work in America. And he's buried in the Bronx at Woodlawn Cemetery, right next to Duke Ellington and Miles Davis, incidentally. Just a gentle, generous genius. And we're very, very fortunate that his family allowed us to continue telling this story. This is a Koji whiskey inspired by his failed experiment, unfortunately, but that is just a very, very interesting bridge between it's 100% made in Japan, but it is not a Japanese whiskey. It is not a love song to Scotch like so many Japanese whiskeys can be or try to be. And it's somehow oddly more American, even though there's no corn in the mash bill. But it's like a bridge between the two cultures, kind of like Dr. Takamine really was back 100 years ago.
I love how things intersect and collide. I had no idea where we were going to go on the podcast today, and I never do. I just read Dr. Takamine's story, and you just recounted and filled in some of the holes in the story. But to your point, this is somebody that if Hollywood's listening or another studio somewhere, Netflix, I don't know, Amazon, this is a story, I think, when you talk about the human experience and just human ingenuity and struggles and achievements and, all right, I kind of got run out of town for this, right? Because you don't want to mess with these Malta people, right? Because they got a bigger lobbying group than you do.
And they're tight with the mafia too.
Yeah. I mean, but what I'm saying is to understand that if all that happened, maybe the EpiPen never would have been invented and other impacts on our life. But it's so fascinating to me of just how life presents itself. And here we are now sharing this Takamine 8-year-old Koji whiskey, which as what you're saying is there's no corn. There's not there. It has such a wonderful nose. And I think part of that may be a lot of what the barrel is imparting. So what is the aging process for this?
It's refilled American oak. So some of the staves are from the Ozarks, and so some ex-bourbon cast there, which gives it a sweetness. It is somehow oddly kind of American, even though it's 100% made in Japan. And the barrels are ricked in a former municipal grain bunker in Fukuoka, Japan. And this grain bunker has massively thick concrete walls that were used to protect grain stores during the war. And now it's used to protect these casks of Takamine Koji whiskey that are aging for a minimum of 8 years. We have some older stuff coming over soon in very, very limited quantities, but it's just, it's such a nice way to remind folks of how amazing this gentleman was and how much he was such an impactful resident of the United States when he lived here. And it also is a reminder that America was so close to koji being part of our culinary story. If it goes into our whiskey, you can imagine that it's only a hop, skip, and a jump away from our food, right? In the 1800s. And today, our food would probably look incredibly different when you think about it, because food and drink always going together. And koji fermentation would have certainly found its way into our food 100 years before it did.
Well, I think you get a lot of that bourbon-esque. Obviously, it comes from the barrel. Yeah. And for 8 years, for that to move in and out of the barrel, this is like, you find your new favorite. This is like now my new favorite whiskey because it has such flavor components that are unlike anything you'll ever have. I also like there's a sourness, this astringent finish to it. Then you get the tannins of the barrel. You get the sweetness. You get the koji. It's such a wonderful journey. This story that is in this bottle. I am so grateful, Christopher, that you're bringing all these out of the shadows and bringing them to the United States. Where can people find these if they want to? If you're in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, like we are, besides reaching out and getting your email address, where can we get a handle on some of these bottles?
Unfortunately, as you know, Pennsylvania is a control state, and we haven't cracked that nut yet. But you can, if you ever find yourself in New Jersey or New York or many other places, then they can help you out. And so. New York City, I'm talking Astor Wines, and you can go to really any decent bottle shop that does hand selling, and they're going to have shochu on the shelf, and more likely than not, they'll probably have one or more of ours now. Especially Mugi Hokka tends to be a crowd favorite, the first one that you tried today. And also to what was it? The Chiran Tichu is doing a really good job. I didn't say when you were tasting it, try it with a coconut liqueur. They love each other. I don't know. It works so well. Green tea, shochu, and coconut liqueur are lovers. But, and then also through our website, honkakuspirits.com, they can help you out too, depending on which state you're in.
All right. So I can go to your website. I can have that shipped to wherever, perhaps, depending on what state I am. Because I'll tell you what, if I were listening to this podcast, and I heard about these 6 expressions, like I want to invite friends over, right? And put these 6 bottles out and say, hey, listen, this is what we're drinking tonight. And I think it's just a wonderful way to understand a lot about what shochu is, a lot about the different terroir, provenance. There's so much here. We spend a little bit of an hour talking, you and I today. Mm-hmm. This could be 4 or 5 hours. We literally could dive into each one for 4 or 5 hours and not get bored. I'm not bored. I want more. I want to play around with these. And, going back to the cocktails, you talked about the lobby bar, and look, New York, no deference to Washington, D.C. or Chicago or, Peoria, Illinois. But that's where cocktails, the epicenter, I think, for where cocktails are originating. Again, I don't want to upset those people in San Francisco either. But what are some of the, what are some of the things you see besides the Negroni? What are some of these cocktails, or talk about some of these cocktail bars where people can, find their way into, where that you're going to have some of these products there available?
Well, Death and Company in Manhattan, and then also in LA, I know has shochu cocktails on the menu. There's down in Washington, D.C., you could hit up a place called Zeppelin, which is a great, good Japanese food, and then a really good bar program as well. And they've got some shochu cocktails on the menu. And it's surprisingly common now to see a shochu cocktail on the menu at places where, yes, the cocktails are likely to be a little bit pricier, but if you're in a place that's charging $16 for a cocktail, which is frighteningly common these days, then you might very well see one. Over in San Francisco, I would be heading to Tsunami Panhandle, Pacific Cocktail Haven, Liho Yacht Club, all of these amazing, of course, Bar Iris, all of these amazing places have you covered when you're looking at Koji spirits. And there are also folks that are intensely nerdy about these things. So you can actually go in there and not just have a good drink, but they can school you on all of the things that are missing from. We only had about an hour to talk today, and there's only so much that we could have covered. There's so much more to it. And it is the people, it is the product process, it is the place. The sense of place is so important. And these folks behind the bar will be able to fill you in. But Chicago's another one, Bar Kumiko, of course, all across the country. Honestly, there's a lot of uptake at the moment. It's an exciting time to be watching.
That's great. And if people want to purchase the Shochu handbook, is that on Amazon? Do they go to a website?
It is on Amazon. Yes, that's the way to go.
Are you reading the Audible version?
No, I should record that, or I get somebody to do it for me anyway. Yeah. But no, you're totally right. Nobody's asked that question for a while. It came up a lot when I first published it about 10 years ago this month, actually. 10 years ago this month. Wow. Huh, maybe it's time to release the Audible as an anniversary present,
Well, I think that, again, this short time together, getting this experience to learn more about Shochu and getting an even broader desire to learn more, going to the handbook, and then now, all right, I can get in even deeper without, really having to go to a lot of different resources to do that. Christopher, is there anything we haven't talked about on the podcast today? Anything you want people to know more about you or more about Honkaku Spirits? I'm still working on that. Honkaku Spirits.
Honkaku Spirits. I mean, I think I just want people to understand that with a category this diverse, there is a shochu for everyone, because shochu can be made from, sweet potatoes and rice and barley, but then it can also be made from chestnuts and aloe and sesame. And there really is a shochu out there for everyone. So once you figure out which flavor profiles you want to zero in on, then you just got to pick your serve. Are you more of a hot serve or a cold serve type of person? Do you want it with sparkling water? You just want it on the rocks? What's your deal? So it takes a little bit of time to dial it in, but it's worth the effort. And the stories behind these brands and the people behind these brands are some of the most just fascinating, thought-provoking, and endearing things you'll ever encounter in your life. So don't be afraid. Keep an open mind. Sip slowly and sip Honkaku.
I'll tell you what, this has been a treat. Thank you so much. I am grateful for your time today. I'm grateful for these 6 expressions that you shared, and all that you're doing to bring understanding, knowledge, curiosity to the shochu world. Thanks for being a friend of Fermented Adventure. I feel like this should be an 8-part series. We'll just revisit with.
I got angles. We can take it in a number of directions in the future.
Look, go find some of these brands. Go to the website, buy all 6. Try some. If you haven't had shochu, you're going to love them. If you're a shochu aficionado, you're going to love them just the same. Christopher, thanks again for your time, and we look forward to our paths crossing. Thanks again so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Kanpai.
Kanpai.